The planet's sky hung heavy with clouds as the kingdom prepared for yet another battle. For weeks, the Queen's advisors had predicted a final confrontation with the neighboring factions. Yet, despite the high walls of the royal palace, despite the elite guards, and despite all their planning, the enemy was getting closer. The Queen had failed. It wasn't the first time. The Queen had faced threats from outside forces before, but this time, it was different. The enemy had grown too powerful. The attacks had become too frequent. The Queen had sent her best warriors, her strongest generals, to the front lines, only to have them return defeated, or worse, never return at all. Her kingdom was crumbling, and the one thing that had kept her hopes alive, the safety of her daughter, was now in jeopardy. In the heart of the royal palace, the Queen paced anxiously back and forth in her chambers. Her advisors stood around her, murmuring amongst themselves, trying to find a solution. But every plan, every tactic they had put forward, had failed. The Queen felt her frustration rising.
"Your Majesty,"
one of the advisors spoke up, his voice shaking.
"We must face the truth.
The enemy is too strong. We cannot win this war."
The Queen's eyes hardened. She had been told this so many times before, but she refused to believe it. She would not accept defeat. Her kingdom had prospered under her rule for decades, and she would not let it fall now.
"I will not surrender,"
she said firmly, her voice echoing in the grand chamber.
"We will find a way to win.
We have the might of the strongest army in the galaxy, and we will use it." Her advisors fell silent, knowing that arguing with her would be useless. The Queen was determined, and once her mind was made up, there was no turning back. As the days went on, the situation only worsened. The Queen's military forces were scattered across the planet, trying to defend the borders, but the enemy had found a way to break through their defenses. The royal guards, once the most feared warriors in the galaxy, were no match for the enemy's cunning strategies. The Queen's only hope now rested in her daughter. The child was young, only 11 years old, but she was believed to possess extraordinary power. Her abilities, though still developing, were said to be unmatched by any other being in the galaxy. The Queen had long kept her daughter hidden, believing it was for her own safety, but now, the child's power might be the only thing that could save them. But the Queen did not fully understand her daughter's abilities. She had always kept her isolated, sheltered from the harsh realities of the war outside. The child had been raised in luxury, surrounded by the finest tutors and caregivers, but had never truly learned the ways of the galaxy. She had never seen the struggles of those who lived outside the palace walls, never experienced the hardships that the common people faced. The child was naive. She trusted easily, perhaps too easily. She saw the world with a sense of innocence that no longer existed in the harsh realities of war, and, despite her power, she lacked the experience to understand the dangers that lay beyond the palace gates. The Queen knew that her daughter would be the key to saving their world, but she feared that the child was too young, too trusting to fully understand the consequences of her actions, and so she decided to keep her daughter close, to protect her from the outside world for just a little longer. But it wasn't just the Queen's fear that kept the child confined to the palace. There were others who sought to control her, others who saw the child's power as a means to secure their own place in the galaxy. The royal guards, though loyal to the Queen, were not always kind to the child. They saw her as a tool to be used, a weapon to be wielded in the battle for survival. Some guards were kind, others were harsh, but all of them treated her like a fragile, precious object, something to be protected at all costs. It was a lonely life for the child, one filled with endless lessons, strict rules, and a constant sense of being watched. She was never allowed to roam the palace freely, never allowed to meet the people of the kingdom, never allowed to experience the outside world. The child often found herself staring out the windows of the palace, yearning for the freedom she had only heard about in the stories told by the few servants who dared to speak to her. And yet, despite her isolation, the child never lost her kindness. She saw the guards as her protectors, even though they often treated her with a cold distance. She saw the servants as her friends, even though they were careful not to say too much. She saw her mother as a ruler, but also as someone who loved her, even if she couldn't always show it. Her world was small, but it was enough for her. Until one day, everything changed. The guards had been sent out on yet another mission to defend the borders, leaving the palace temporarily unprotected. The child was in her chambers, quietly reading a book, when she heard the sound of footsteps approaching. At first, she thought it was one of the guards. But then she saw him, a human soldier. She had heard of humans before. They were known throughout the galaxy for their strength, their ingenuity, and their unyielding determination. But they were also considered primitive by many, seen as little more than tools in the great intergalactic struggle. The child had never met one in person, though, and she was curious. The soldier entered the room cautiously, his eyes scanning the space before landing on the child. He was tall, with dark hair and a calm expression. His uniform was different from the ones the royal guards wore, simple, practical, yet functional. The child looked up at him with wide eyes. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice gentle. The soldier hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I am Captain David, a member of the human delegation," he said. "I've been sent to assist with the defense of your planet." The child tilted her head, still unsure of what to make of him. "Why are you here?" "Shouldn't you be fighting the enemy?" David smiled softly. "Sometimes even soldiers need to take a break. I was sent to make sure you're safe." The child blinked in confusion. "Safe? But I thought the guards were supposed to protect me." David nodded. "They are, but I'm here to help too." The child smiled, sensing something different about this man. He was not like the others. He spoke to her with kindness, not as a tool to be protected, but as someone who might actually understand her. For the first time in a long while, the child felt a sense of comfort. She had grown tired of the palace walls, of the constant vigilance of the guards. She wanted to know more about the world outside, to see the stars, to meet new people, to understand what her mother and the kingdom were fighting for. And for reasons she could not explain, she felt that this human soldier might be the one to help her. "Would you show me the world outside?" she asked. David looked at her, surprised by the request. But something in the child's eyes made him hesitate. There was innocence there, a hopefulness that he hadn't seen in a long time.
"I can't leave the palace, not with the enemy so close," he said, his voice soft.
"But maybe we can find a way to show you more of the galaxy, one step at a time." The child's eyes sparkled with excitement, and for a brief moment, she felt a warmth in her heart that she had never known before. She had found someone who didn't treat her like a fragile piece of royalty, someone who saw her as more than just the queen's daughter. He saw her as a person, and for the first time in a long while, the child trusted someone completely. The queen's reign might be faltering, but there was still hope. Hope that this human soldier might be the key to unlocking a future the child had never imagined. But little did the child know, the trust she placed in him would change not just her life, but the fate of her entire world. As the days passed, the queen's palace grew quieter, the weight of impending doom hanging over the halls like a shadow. The enemy forces were closing in, their ships appearing in the sky, moving ever closer to the heart of the kingdom. The royal guards, though dedicated, were growing weary. They could only hold their positions for so long before they too would be overrun. Yet in the midst of this chaos, the child found herself drawn to a human soldier, a man whose presence seemed to calm the storm around her. David, the human soldier, had quickly become someone the child trusted. He had an air of calm about him, something that made her feel safe, even in these uncertain times. She had spent so much of her life in the palace, surrounded by guards and servants, always kept in the dark about the true dangers of the galaxy. But David spoke to her differently than anyone else. He didn't treat her like a fragile piece of royalty. He didn't look at her as the queen's daughter or a symbol of power. He looked at her like a person, someone worth knowing. The child had always felt isolated, hidden away from the world. She had learned from a young age that her power made her different from everyone else. The guards, though they were tasked with protecting her, kept their distance. They would never let her out of the palace, never let her experience the world beyond the high walls. They treated her like a delicate flower, something to be protected, but never understood. But David was different. He treated her like a person, not a weapon, and it made her feel like she was finally seen. One afternoon, as the sun began to set and painted the sky in shades of red and orange, the child found herself standing in the palace gardens. She had been here countless times before, but today it felt different. Today, she wasn't just standing on the edge of her world, watching the sky. Today, she was taking her first steps into something new. David had come to her earlier that day, offering to take her to a place outside the palace walls, a small hidden valley where the people of the kingdom had once gathered. It was a place that was off-limits to everyone but the royal family, a place where the queen had grown up. The child had heard stories of it, but she had never seen it herself. Now, with David at her side, she would finally get a glimpse of the world beyond the palace. She met him at the garden's edge, where the flowers seemed to be reaching toward the sun, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the dull gray of the palace behind them. David was standing there, waiting for her, his usual calm expression softened by a small smile. "You ready?" he asked, his voice steady as always. The child nodded eagerly, her heart beating a little faster in excitement. She had spent so much time yearning to see more of the world. And now, for the first time, she was actually going to experience it. They walked together through the palace gates, which were usually locked tight. Today they opened with little resistance. The guards at the entrance barely acknowledged their departure, as if they had been waiting for this moment to come. The child noticed how different everything seemed outside the palace walls. The air was fresher, the sky brighter, and the world felt larger somehow. She felt as though she were stepping into a new chapter of her life, one where she wasn't just a figurehead, but someone capable of making her own decisions. As they walked, David spoke to her about the galaxy, about Earth, his home planet, and the people there. He told her stories of human resilience, how they had overcome countless challenges to become a force in the galaxy. The child listened intently, fascinated by everything he had to say. To her, Earth seemed like a place of freedom, a place where people could forge their own futures. It was everything she had ever dreamed of. They reached the hidden valley just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape. The valley was beautiful, a lush expanse of green surrounded by tall trees. Wildflowers bloomed in the open spaces, and the sound of birds singing filled the air. It was a place of peace, a place where the weight of the world seemed to fade away. David led her to a small clearing where they sat on the soft grass. The child looked around in awe, taking in the beauty of the place. She had never seen anything like it. The palace had always felt so confined, so full of rules and expectations. But here, in this quiet valley, she felt free. "This is where I used to come when I was a child," David said, his voice soft. "My people didn't have palaces or castles. We didn't have the luxury of living in a place like this. But we found beauty in the simple things, in the quiet, in nature." The child looked at him, her eyes wide with curiosity. "What was Earth like before you came here?" David paused for a moment, as if thinking carefully about how to answer. "It was a place of struggle. We had wars, just like your people, but we also had moments of peace, and we learned how to survive." How to rebuild. Earth wasn't perfect, but it was ours. The child thought about this. "It sounds different," she said quietly. It sounds like you were free." David nodded, a hint of sadness in his eyes. In a way, we were. We had to fight for our freedom, but it was worth it. Sometimes the hardest battles are the ones that teach you the most. The child was silent for a moment, processing what he had said. She had always been told that the Queen's kingdom was the greatest in the galaxy, that their power was unmatched, but David's words made her question everything she had ever known. Was there more to life than what the palace offered? Was there more to the universe than the walls that had always confined her? "I wish I could see Earth," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I wish I could see it the way you did." David smiled softly, his gaze turning toward the stars. "Maybe one day you will. You're a strong girl. You have the power to do anything you set your mind to." The child looked up at the sky, the stars twinkling in the vastness of space. For the first time in her life, she felt like she had a future beyond the palace walls. She had always believed that her destiny was tied to the fate of the kingdom, but now she saw a different path, a path where she could choose her own future, where she could be more than just a princess. She turned to David, a new determination in her eyes. "I want to help. I want to make a difference. I don't want to hide anymore. I want to fight for my people, for our future." David looked at her, his expression serious. "You're already making a difference. But remember, you don't have to do this alone. I'll be by your side, whatever happens." The child nodded, her heart filled with a newfound sense of purpose. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she felt ready to face it. She was no longer just a queen's daughter. She was someone who could change the course of history. As they sat there, in the quiet of the valley, the child knew that her life was about to change forever. She could feel it in her bones. The power of her people, the strength of the galaxy, would no longer be controlled by her mother or the palace guards. It would belong to her and to those she trusted. And with David by her side, she felt that anything was possible. The days following the visit to the hidden valley passed in a blur of uncertainty and rising tension. The enemy forces were closer than ever, and the Queen's once unshakable confidence had begun to waver. She no longer believed her military forces were enough to stop the inevitable. The kingdom was falling apart, and with each passing hour, hope seemed to slip further away. But in the midst of it all, the child's resolve grew stronger. She had learned more in the past few days than she had in her entire life. Her eyes had been opened to the truth about the world beyond the palace walls. She had spent so much time locked away in safety, never knowing the struggles of her people or the hardships that others faced. And now, with David's guidance, she began to see the universe in a new light. Though her mother, the Queen, continued to ignore the child's wishes, seeing her as nothing more than a tool to be used, the child refused to stay silent. She had already come to understand that the future of her world was no longer in the hands of the guards, or even the Queen. It was in her hands. David had become her ally, her confidant, and her teacher. Every conversation they had was filled with knowledge, not just about the galaxy, but about what it meant to be strong, to fight for what was right. He didn't speak to her like a soldier to a royal. He spoke to her as an equal, as someone who had the potential to shape the future of the galaxy. And she trusted him completely. The child had come to believe that the only way to save her people was to confront the truth of their situation head-on. No longer would she hide behind the walls of the palace, waiting for someone else to act. It was time to make a choice that could change everything. One night, while the Queen was away dealing with matters of state, the child slipped out of her chambers. She had been planning this moment for weeks, and she knew it was time to act. With David's help, she had made preparations. The enemy was closing in, and it was only a matter of time before they attacked. The guards would be too distracted by the fighting at the borders to notice her departure. The palace was silent as she walked through the halls, the only sound being the soft rustle of her footsteps on the marble floors. Her heart beat faster with every step she took, a mix of excitement and fear coursing through her veins. This was the moment she had been waiting for. No longer would she sit idly by while the kingdom crumbled. She was going to do something about it. When she reached the gates, she found David waiting for her. He stood in the shadows, his figure barely visible against the dark night sky. He had always been there for her, and tonight he was ready to help her take the first step toward freedom. "You're sure about this?" David asked quietly, his voice filled with concern. "This is dangerous." The child nodded. "I'm sure. The only way we can save my people is by taking action. We can't wait any longer. The kingdom is falling apart, and if we don't do something now, we'll lose everything." David hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "All right."
Let's go. I'll follow your lead.
Together, they moved quickly through the shadows, slipping past the guards unnoticed. The child felt a strange sense of freedom as she walked through the palace gates, her entire world suddenly feeling bigger and more expansive. She was no longer confined by the walls of the palace. For the first time, she was free. They traveled through the night, moving quietly through the dense forests surrounding the kingdom. The further they went, the more the child felt a sense of purpose growing within her. She had never been outside the palace before, and now she was seeing the world for the first time. The trees were thick with leaves, their branches stretching high above them. The air smelled fresh and earthy, a stark contrast to the sterile, polished halls of the palace. As the hours passed, the journey began to take its toll. The child was tired, but she kept moving forward, driven by a sense of urgency. They had a mission, and there was no time to waste. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they arrived at a small, secluded village. It was hidden deep within the forest, far from the kingdom's capital. The villagers lived simple lives, working the land and tending to their animals. They were the forgotten people of the kingdom, those who had never seen the grandeur of the royal palace, never tasted the wealth that the queen and her court enjoyed. The child had heard stories of them, but had never imagined what their lives were truly like. As they entered the village, the child could feel the eyes of the villagers on her. They were curious, hesitant. She was royalty, after all, and they had never seen someone like her in person. But David was with her, and that made all the difference. He introduced her to the village leaders, and soon they were gathered around a fire, discussing their plans. The child could see the wariness in their eyes, the uncertainty. They didn't trust her at first, not knowing whether she was truly here to help or just another royal figure sent to control them. But as the conversation continued, as David spoke of the need for unity and strength, the villagers began to listen. The child stood up, her voice steady despite the uncertainty she felt inside. "I know you don't trust me," she said, her gaze sweeping across the group. "But I need you to understand. I'm not here as a queen's daughter. I'm here as someone who believes in the future of this planet, someone who believes we can do better than what we've been given. The guards, the military, the palace, it's all failed, but together we can fight for something better." There was a long silence, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Then, slowly, one of the villagers stood up. He was an older man, his face lined with age and hardship, but there was a glimmer of something in his eyes, hope. "We've been waiting for someone to lead us," he said, his voice rough but strong. "But we've always been overlooked. We've always been forgotten. If you're willing to fight with us, then we'll fight with you." The child nodded, a sense of determination flooding her chest. This was what she had been searching for, a chance to truly make a difference. The people of the kingdom were not just the queen's subjects. They were more than that. They were the heart and soul of the world, and it was time for them to take their future into their own hands. With David by her side, the child began to make plans with the villagers. They would need to move quickly, gather supplies, and build a strategy. But for the first time in her life, the child felt a sense of unity. She was not alone. She had the support of the people, and that was all that mattered. As the night wore on, they continued to discuss their plans, laying the groundwork for what would come next. The child knew there was much more to be done, but she also knew that this was the first step. She had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. When the morning sun began to rise, casting a golden light over the village, the child stood at the edge of the clearing, looking out at the vast world before her. It was no longer just a place of beauty and peace. It was a place of hope, a place where anything was possible. With David by her side and the people's trust in her, the child was ready to face whatever came next. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: she would fight for it. The village had changed overnight. What had once been a quiet, humble place, hidden deep in the forest, was now the center of a growing movement. The child, no longer simply the queen's daughter, but a leader in her own right, had sparked something in the villagers. She could see it in their eyes. The same fire that had ignited within her when she made the decision to leave the palace. They were ready to fight for their future, just as she was. Over the next few days, the child worked tirelessly with the villagers, building a strategy to stand against the enemy forces that were swiftly approaching. David was by her side, guiding her, helping her make the difficult decisions that would shape their destiny. He had become more than just a protector. He was her partner, and together they were leading the charge toward a future they both believed in. The child was learning quickly. He had never known the complexities of war, of how to plan for an assault, or how to organize people who had lived in peace for so long. But David was a patient teacher, showing her how to think strategically, how to use her people's strengths to their advantage. He taught her the value of preparation, of patience, and of trust. As the days passed, the villagers began to come together in ways they never had before. The elderly shared their wisdom, the farmers offered their tools, and the young people, eager to fight for their home, trained under David's watchful eye. The child, too, took part in the training, learning how to defend herself, how to use the weapons the villagers had crafted. Though her mind was always focused on the bigger picture, they gathered weapons and supplies, building alliances with other isolated villages in the region. Word spread quickly about the young leader who had dared to challenge the queen's reign. At first, many were skeptical. The queen's power was legendary, and the idea of a small group of villagers standing against her seemed impossible. But as the child and David's influence grew, so did their numbers. More and more people came to join their cause, bringing their knowledge, their strength, and their courage. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the valley, the child stood at the edge of the village, looking out at the world before her. The wind rustled the trees, and for a moment, she allowed herself to feel the weight of what was to come. The battle was inevitable. The enemy was close, and the time for hiding was over. She had made the choice to fight, and now there was no turning back. David joined her, standing beside her in silence for a moment. He, too, could feel the tension in the air, the anticipation of what lay ahead.
I've never led anyone before, the child said quietly, her voice steady but filled with uncertainty. I've spent my whole life being told what to do, being protected.
Now I have to protect them. I have to lead them. David looked at her, his expression calm but serious.
You're already leading them.
You've given them hope, and you've given yourself the strength to do what needs to be done. The people believe in you because you believe in them. That's what a leader does. You trust the people, and they'll trust you. The child nodded, grateful for his words. She had come so far, from the lonely princess in the palace to the determined leader standing on the brink of war. She could feel the weight of her responsibility. But she also felt something else, a deep sense of purpose. She was no longer fighting for her title or her mother's approval. She was fighting for the people, for a future where they could live free from fear and oppression. As night fell, the village gathered for a meeting, and the child stood at the front, ready to speak to her people. She had spent countless hours thinking about this moment, about the words she would say. She knew that this would be the defining moment, the moment that would either strengthen their resolve or shatter their hope. The villagers, young and old, were gathered around the fire, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. There was a quiet anticipation in the air, a sense of unity that hadn't existed before. They were ready to hear what she had to say. The child stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She took a deep breath and looked out at the crowd, her gaze meeting the eyes of those who had come to trust her.
I know you're all afraid, she began, her voice strong and clear.
The enemy is close, and the Queen's forces are powerful. We don't have the resources, we don't have the armies, but we have something stronger than that. We have each other. We have the will to fight for what's right, for the future of our world. She paused, allowing her words to sink in. The villagers were listening intently, hanging on every word. We've lived in the shadow of the Queen's palace for too long, she continued. We've been told that we're not important, that our voices don't matter. But we do matter, every single one of us. We are not just subjects of the Queen. We are the heart of this world. And it's time for us to take our place in the future. Her voice grew stronger with each word. We will fight not because we want war, but because we want peace. We want a future where our children can live without fear, where we can build something better than what we've been given. We're not just fighting for ourselves. We're fighting for everyone who has been forgotten, for everyone who has been left behind. The fire crackled in the silence that followed her words. The child could see the change in the faces of the villagers. There was a spark of something in their eyes. Determination, courage, hope. They were no longer just following her. They were standing beside her, ready to fight. David stood at her side, his presence a quiet reassurance. He knew this was her moment. He knew that the child had become the leader they all needed. We'll stand together, the child finished. We'll fight as one, and no matter what happens, we will never stop believing in a better future. The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices rising in unison. The child felt a rush of emotion in her chest, a mixture of pride, fear, and hope. She had led them to this point, and now they were ready to take the next step. Together they would face the enemy and fight for their future. The night was filled with a sense of purpose, and as the fire burned down to embers, the child knew that they were ready. The battle would come, but they were no longer the forgotten people of the kingdom. They were a force to be reckoned with. As dawn broke over the village, the child and David stood at the front of the gathered crowd, ready to lead them into the unknown. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: they would face it together. The child was no longer just a princess. She was a leader, and with the people by her side, she was ready to fight for the future they all deserved. The kingdom would never be the same.